Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. We're going to wait a couple of minutes to get started as the rest of the group trickles in. While we're pausing, I see there are a few of you who don't have affiliations by your name. So I wanted to invite you just to edit your Zoom name. It's the small button with 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner. If you would be so kind as just to add, if you like, your pronouns, and then also your the organization or the community that you are here to represent or speak on behalf of today. And if you are with the city of Portland, if you would do us the favor of starting that affiliation with city, that's going to help us as we do some sorting later. Thanks, everybody, for doing that. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes to get started. Okay, we're just going to wait about 1 more minute because we still have a good stream of folks coming. You've just arrived. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I just, small request, if you haven't already, please go ahead to your Zoom window and add, if you'd like, your pronouns and then also your affiliation after your name. So the organization or the community that you are here to speak on behalf of. And if you're with the city of Portland, if you could please just start that affiliation with the word city so we can find you later. If you have any questions about that, you can go ahead and message me in the chat. I'm Marty Frank. I'm your facilitator for today. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Vin, do you agree? I see it. Our new entrants have slowed to a trickle.
Sure, that sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Marty Frank. I already mentioned I am here to act as your facilitator. And as you probably know, this is a public meeting. So to let you all know officially, we are recording today. To get us started from the very get-go, I'd like to welcome the Acting Director of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, Donnie Oliveira. Donnie, would you go ahead and unmute yourself? And if I could ask everybody else to please put yourself on mute at the moment.
Thanks, Marty. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Donnie Oliveira. I use he, him pronouns. I want to just start by thanking all of you for being here and for all the work you've invested to this point, both on the project we're here to meet about and all the work you've been doing to support Portland's communities and the greater region's efforts on climate. Just like to start by acknowledging that there is no mistaking it that the climate crisis is here today and is already impacting Portlanders in the form of ice storms, extreme heat waves, and then personally with high housing costs and just the ability to exist. Our communities are under duress, and we can't correlate much of the burden to climate change and the impacts that are exacerbated by climate change. Data and people's lived experiences show us again and again that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately bearing the brunt of these burdens. We've recognized in Portland's Climate Emergency Declaration that not everyone is affected the same by the impacts of climate change. So it's led us to evolve our approach to solutions that take into that account. We want to thank you here for pushing the city to look at the work differently, because here we have a vision where local government, business, community members, tenants, climate advocates collaborate to design climate justice policies that improve the quality of our built environment while delivering measurable benefits to Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Because in order to stop escalating climate change, we need to do more, and especially in our building sector, looking at the supporting renters who often have no control over the energy use or cooling capacity of their living spaces. How we address our policies directly impacts our communities. Portland City Council declared a climate emergency in 2020 and explicitly committed city bureaus to ensuring that any policy efforts to decarbonize the building sector will prioritize leadership from frontline communities and emphasize improved comfort, safety, and utility savings, not just for the building owners, but for renters, and especially looking at protections for low-income tenants. Let's help reduce displacement and promote community stability across our region. BPS has been working hand in hand with a group of BIPOC community advocates, many of whom are here today, known as the Build Shift Collective, specifically looking to identify the priorities and goals that are essential to center our policy changes regarding buildings at the city level. I'm impressed with Build Shift's collective thoughtfulness and the key results identified as the hard standards that will guide our work. We need healthy living spaces for all, equitable access to energy, and anti-displacement strategies. This is resiliency. This is increasing our resilience to extreme and predictable weather and temperature controls that keep everyone safe in disasters. Just if reflecting on the incredible weather patterns we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, that's the norm. How do we respond and keep our communities resilient and prepared in this emergency? We also know that Portland's largest commercial multifamily buildings, which emit more than half of the greenhouse gases from the built environment, we need more from them to achieve our climate goals. And some of you may be wondering, well, won't that add cost to Portland's business community at a particularly bad time? Well, there's no good time to increase costs for our businesses, and yet we know that we have to take change. And we understand that the primary concern for building owners will be costs. So we intend to design a policy with this in mind. BPS staff will get into the details throughout this process, but we are proposing a concept that is designed to allow buildings to choose the most cost-effective pathways to meet the targets. We understand that property owners and building managers have capital programs and plans. Let's leverage those. A concept that is being designed would be a phase-in period over time, allowing for long-range planning and strategy and taking advantage of new technologies. The city intends to collaborate with the private and nonprofit sectors to find and expand resources like the Energy Trust of Oregon to help offset costs of policy compliance. The city is also exploring the use of federal infrastructure dollars and state programs. And I have to acknowledge that the Portland Clean Energy Fund may be an option for providing resources to community-led projects that upgrade rental apartments to meet the new standards. The city is committed to seeking out expanding resources creatively, but we can't do it alone. We'll be asking building owners to do their part as well, and looking to all of you for your guidance and leadership as we continue this conversation. I want to thank you again for being here and look forward to working with all the stakeholders to create a comprehensive, effective, just, and fair ordinance together. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Vin Mason, and want to acknowledge Vin's leadership in this process. Thank you, Vin.
Okay, thank you, Acting Director Oliveira. I'm actually going to take the floor back, if you don't mind, but we'll go to Vin. We'll go to Vin in just a minute. Okay, everyone, I want to ask you the same question that we asked the kickoff, which is, are you ready to do some big thinking? Okay, because that is what we are here to do today. The climate and health standards policy that we are going to be talking about today in our succeeding meetings, it is going to influence the health, the safety, the carbon emissions of Portland's multifamily and commercial buildings over the next generation. So I want to start by asking you all to imagine out 30 years from now, approximately, to 2050. What do you see? What people do you see in 2050? What places? What do they look like? What other things, right? What other things are there in 2050? And this vision that you have of 2050, okay, I would like to ask you to keep that in mind as we are talking about this climate and health standards policy. Because the work that we are doing here in this room, it is as much about 30 years from now as it is about today. This policy is about planning. It's about preparation. So that 30 years from now, our multifamily and commercial buildings are not just climate ready, zero carbon, they are also healthy and safe places to live and work. So we have asked you all here today to provide your input to this policy. We're asking you to speak to your values, to share your vision, to bring us your questions, okay, to contribute your expertise. We are going to have 4, maybe 5 work sessions together. And these sessions, as the acting director said, are going to cover the details of policy implementation, the resources, financial and technical, that can support these improvements to buildings. And we're going to talk about how we do this work equitably. And I want to let you all know that, the topics of these meetings are going to be based both on the city's questions for you. what the city needs to understand in order to develop this policy, but also on the subjects that you tell us are important to you. And we have been waiting to hear from you all to finalize the details, and you can expect to hear more on that from us in the next week. Okay, let's turn to today. So today's focus is on learning. I'm going to drop our agenda into the chat, and you should have received it by email. There it is. We're going to start with some introductions. And then we're going to dig in for about an hour of learning from 5 regional and national experts. They're going to talk in detail about what this type of policy tends to look like and the nuts and bolts of what it actually means to decarbonize buildings. After that hour of learning, we're going to take a short break. I think it's probably going to be a micro break. Then we're going to come back for about an hour of discussion in small groups where actually you all are going to be the instructors, right? It's going to be your turn to educate us, educate the city. And the team that they've assembled here with your questions, your interests, information about your organizations, your business processes. Okay, so first I want to very, very quickly go over 2 items before we dig in. I'm going to share again in the chat. These are the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability's ground rules for meetings. So all of these things, if you were at the kickoff, Vin did a really excellent presentation of them then. These are all in service to how we engage as a group, right? To how we come together to foster a successful collaborative process. Okay, so I think the key thing that I personally take away from these is that we really all want to be acting with a sense of self-awareness and with reflection, right? Both in what we say and the fact that we, choose to contribute, or at times maybe we choose to sit back and listen to what others are saying. And if you want, I welcome you to use the reflection buttons on the right side of the Zoom toolbar if you want to let us know that you're willing to do your best to abide by each of these principles. And finally, I was saying earlier as we were planning this meeting, I almost hesitate to go over Zoom etiquette because I kind of feel like we're very much aware, but I feel obligated. Please stay on mute unless we ask you to unmute or until we get into our small group discussions. I want to strongly recommend that you hide your self view. It's a heavy cognitive load to focus on others and look at yourself all day. I want to recommend that we put ourselves on do not disturb on our phones and our computers. And then finally, I want to invite you to utilize the chat. Please pose questions, respond to what you're hearing, use reactions. And finally, technical support today is Wing Gabrowski. You'll see his name in the chat window. Please message him if you have any technical questions. Okay, moving on. We are going to do some introductions. We are not going to do introductions in the usual way because of the size of this group. And so now I would like to call on Vin Mason. Now, I think many, if not most of you already know Vin through the work that he's done to get us to this point, and also the many other projects he's led for the Bureau over the last several years. Vin is Senior Climate Policy Advisor, and he helps develop policies that reduce building carbon emissions while also advancing racial equity. So Vin, can I turn it over to you to introduce the city team and some of the other people who are going to serve as resources in this effort?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Marty. And great to see you all. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate you carving a big chunk out of your day here, but also for the next 8 weeks to work together. Yeah, so again, I'm with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I've been working with BPS, I'll refer to us as BPS, since 2007. And so I know I've met many of you along the way. But for those who I haven't met, it's very good to meet you here in this space, and hopefully in person before we're all done at some point or another. So we do have a group of city resource teams that we are bringing to the table here. They are stakeholders as well, but they are here available to answer questions about their own programs that are currently happening, but also planned in the future. So I wanted to name who they are. And if you are within that city resource team, please enter your name, affiliation, name, pronouns, and affiliation into the chat so folks can see who's on that city resource team. And then everyone else can do a verbal introduction right after. So the team is, of course, BPS at the city, but also BDS, the Bureau of Development Services, Portland Housing Bureau, Commissioner Rubio's office, Energy Trust of Oregon, the Institute for Market Transformation, or IMT, the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, NEA, Northwest Natural, Pacific Power, and PGE. So please enter your names in the chat if you are without. And here comes a new one. I just saw Isaac Barrow as waiting in the room here. So we'll just wait for Isaac and let him know also that he is suddenly the star of the show. Welcome, Isaac. If you could enter your name as part of the city resource team as being representing PGE into the chat, that would be great. Your name, pronouns, and organization, and then we'll have a verbal introduction for the other stakeholders. That'll save us a little time too. We'll all get to know each other over time.
Thanks, Vin. Yeah, and we're going to have small groups to kind of dig in and start to build some of those relationships. So I am going to do my best to identify people in the participant list right now who are not the people who Vin has called out as part of kind of the city resource team. And so if I call your name and you do feel like you're part of that team, you can politely decline to introduce yourself verbally. So I'm going to call 3 people. So first person, if you would introduce yourself, and then the succeeding 2 people, you can kind of consider yourselves on deck. Angela with OSEA, if you would go first, and then I see Boma, Oregon, and Brian Hoop with Housing Oregon. And I'll put this in the chat, but just would love to hear your voice and hear your name, your pronouns if you'd like, and your affiliation.
Great, thanks. Amy's get to go first. My name is Angela Crowley-Cook. I'm the Executive Director of OSEA, the Oregon Solar Plus Storage Industries Association, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm excited to be here with all of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Angela. Boma, Oregon. We'll come back to Boma. I believe we had Brian Hoop with Housing Oregon.
Hi, this is Brian Hoop. You see him pronouns, Executive Director for Housing Oregon. I think I put my name early in the chat box too.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I see EPRC Gale. And then I see Jiraj Singh with Unite Oregon and Jake Rosenberg with
Hi.
I'm Gail, your audio is having a hard time coming through. Maybe could you just introduce yourself in the chat? That would be great. Thank you. And then I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, Jiraj Singh, Unite Oregon. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Jairaj Singh with Unite Oregon, Climate Resilience and Environmental Justice Director. Thanks.
Thank you, Jairaj. And Jake with Kaiser Permanente.
Good afternoon, Jake Rosenberg. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Executive Director of Facilities Design and Construction for Kaiser Permanente in the Northwest Market.
Thank you, Jake. Okay, next 3 folks, Jeff Bissonette, and then Jeremy Seimer, and Matthew Chabold. Again, apologies if I have slaughtered the pronunciation of your name. As someone whose married name starts with 4 consonants, I'm sympathetic to that. Okay, Jeremy, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. Jeremy Simmer, SEIU Local 49. And he pronouns.
Okay, thank you so much. And Matthew?
Hi, Matthew Schaubold. You got it right. I'm with the part of the city resource team with the Portland Housing Bureau.
You are. Okay, thank you. If you wouldn't mind just adding that city identification in your name, that would be fantastic.
Sure thing.
Thank you so much. Okay, Molly McGrew. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm Molly McGrew. I'm in a dual capacity role representing both the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, as well as Multifamily Northwest. And our Deputy Director, Michael Havlick, he's either on the call or he's coming today later. So thank you for having us both here. And my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you so much. I see next up, and I'm trying to go alphabetically, Michael Harrison, and then after Michael, Michelle Pinkham. Michael, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Michael Harrison. I work at OHSU. My pronouns are he, him, his. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Michelle?
Yes, thank you. My name's Michelle Pinkham. I am Nimipu from the Nez Perce Nation out of Idaho. I am the Community Engagement and Development Specialist for the Native American Rehabilitation Association of the Northwest here in Portland, and I have no preferred pronouns. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Misha from Apano, and then following Misha, Nora Apter and Stephen Cass. Misha.
Hi, I'm Misha. I use all pronouns, and I'm Apano's Environmental Justice Manager.
Thanks, Misha. Nora, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nora Apter. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Climate Program Director with the Oregon Environmental Council. Really looking forward to getting to know and working with everybody.
Thank you so much, Nora. Stephen Cass.
Hi, I'm Steve Cass. I'm a housing enforcement supervisor with the Bureau of Development Services. We enforce the city's minimum property maintenance codes, so we do a lot of inspections in rental properties.
Thank you so much. And those of you, I think Nora and Steve and a few others of you, if you haven't already, if you wouldn't mind just adding your affiliation to your Zoom name, that'll help us when we're creating our small groups in a little bit. Next up, Suzanne, and then Taylor. Suzanne, would you like to go first?
Okay. My name is Suzanne, and I coordinate the Allies for Healthier Oregon program at the nonprofit We Can Do Better.
Thank you so much. And Taylor with Home Forward.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Taylor Smiley Wolf, she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Planning for Home Forward. We're the housing authority for Multnomah County.
Thank you so much. Next up, Wendy, and then Will. Wendy, you might be speaking. I think you're on mute.
There we go. Yes. Hi, Wendy Wilcox. She, her pronouns, Prosper Portland. I work in green building, policy compliance, and business and workforce equity policy compliance and development.
Thank you so much. And Will with SEIU.
Good afternoon, Will Lang, he, him pronouns, Director of Property Services with SEIU Education and Support Fund, a national nonprofit affiliated with SEIU.
Thank you so much. And David Van Hoff.
Hi, Dave Antoff here, consultant with Climate Solutions, and I use he, him pronouns. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, David. Okay, did anybody not get a chance to introduce themselves either out loud or in the chat who would like to do so? So if you'd like, Kara, thank you for raising your hand. Go ahead. You're on mute though.
Thank you. Hi, Kara Saylor. I'm a staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School. Thanks for letting me be here today. Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you so much. Jeff Bissonette.
Jeff Bissonette, he, him, his pronouns, representing the Northwest Energy Coalition.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Hal Nelson.
Hi, Hal Nelson. I'm Associate Professor at Portland State, and I'm pretty happy to be here. So I use he, him pronouns. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to you all for raising your hands. It's super helpful to be able to find you. Amanda Ingmeyer, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Amanda Ingmeyer, she, her pronouns, and I'm with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. And Aaron.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Pressberg. I'm the Senior Program Manager of Energy and Sustainability with Portland Public Schools.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, last opportunity. Anybody else who'd like to introduce themselves? Sorry, I just realized I have a second page to scroll to. Okay, raise your hand or go ahead and unmute yourself if you have not yet and want to introduce yourself. Okay, great. Oh, go ahead. Okay, I think we're ready to move on. Thank you all so much for taking the time to do that. I think it's really, it's certainly helpful for me as a facilitator, I think for all of us to really start to understand who is in this room. And we're going to learn a lot more about that in the couple hours ahead and in the weeks ahead. What I'd like to do now is turn to the hour or so of learning that we have planned for you. We're going to hear from 5 people during the next 50 to 70 minutes, all of whom are experts in building and climate policy and building decarbonizations. And I want to let you know that I think these presentations that they're going to present really complement one another. And so I'd like to ask us to take in all of them together before we start our discussion. So as you're listening, I want to invite you to put your questions, the things that are coming to mind for you, please put them into the chat. Or if you prefer, jot them down. We want to capture all those questions that come up so that we can use them at the start of our discussion. So our first 3 speakers are Vin Mason, who needs no further introduction, Nikita Daryanani, and Zachary Hart. So let me introduce Nikita and Zach to you before they get started. Nikita Daryanani, if you want to wave, Nikita, I saw you introduced yourself in the chat. Nikita is Climate and Energy Policy Manager at the Coalition of Communities of Color, CCC. She elevates the needs and priorities of low-income communities of color to advance policies that center environmental justice, health equity, and community resilience. And Zachary Hart is Associate Director of Building Performance Policy at the Institute for Market Transformation, IMT. Zach works with local governments around the US, helping them with innovative policies and programs to reduce energy waste in buildings. And Zach has a pretty unique perspective in that he understands what's happening right now in many different places. So he's got both policy expertise and on the ground knowledge, and he is helping Portland learn from what other cities and states have done. So I'd like to turn it over, the floor over to you, Vin.
There's my mute hiding. Okay, thank you, Marty. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing a presentation. Those of you who are in the stakeholder launch event on February 28th, some of these look familiar. There are a few new slides in there, so just letting you know it's not exactly the same. Okay, how is that looking? Good? Okay, great. And I'm going to move my chat out of the way here so I can see my own presentation. All right. So I wanted to share some background on how we arrived at the policy concept that we're sharing through with this building working group to help refine. So it won't just be me sharing some background. I also wanted to invite, as noted, Nikita Daryanani, who has been in the leadership of the Build Shift team through the Coalition of Communities of Color, and then Zachary Hart, who has been a national partner in our policy development for the last several years, but also I've known Zach for probably a decade now. On when we actually started with the commercial energy reporting program that some of you or your membership currently reports to the city of Portland on annual energy use and carbon emissions. Okay, so to start off here, this events. So I wanted to just kind of take a worldview for just a second and refer to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is made up of thousands of the world's top scientists that do work related to climate change. And as we're seeing this week, in April, our first snowstorm in April of measurable snow, that we expect more extreme weather. And so that's in the form of human-induced climate change, I should say. So in the form of heat waves and extreme snowstorms and flooding, wildfires, and I'll get into that a little more what that means in Portland. But there is a lot that was released in a 6th assessment report. A lot by, I mean, the summary is 3,765 pages long. I'm not going to cover all that. These are what I saw as the top kind of pieces that were new also to me. So not so new is that they've been saying for a while that our most vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected by climate change. What is new is irreversible impacts to natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. And so what I see that is that if we continue to release carbon emissions as we have been, that our planet is no longer resilient. So essentially, to be resilient to climate change, we can't just focus on resilience. To be resilient, we have to reduce emissions. So let's bring this a little closer to home for a minute here. So some of you are familiar with the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, or OCRI. They're based out of Oregon State University, over 100 Oregon scientists involved in their work. And they also inform the International Panel on Climate Change. Some of them are members of that United Nations panel. And so what we hear from them in terms of preparing as cities and counties and the whole state, we need to prepare for heavier winter storms like what we've been having this week. We need to prepare for impacts on tribal cultural resources like first foods. We need to prepare for increasing wildfire frequency and size. And we had a sense for that over the last few years, but particularly in terms of magnitude, there was the September 2020 fires that came out of the mountains right to the front doorstep of Portland. Actually came through Oregon City a bit, burned in Milwaukee, and fortunately, the winds turned off before it really started to rip through neighborhoods. So the other thing is, as we experienced last summer, is more hot days, hotter days, and longer heat waves. So I wanted to point to an example of that is our heat dome. So this is a graph that came from Multnomah County, where it's graphing based on the temperature records that are available to us for the city of Portland and in the county. That's seasonally, we have a variation in maximum temperatures, so our highs of the day. And so, of course, in July and August, we typically have these higher temperatures, the record previously being 107 degrees. But then in June, early on in the year, last year, for I think probably all of us were here for that and experienced it, right? But here's a bit of data. On the first day of the heat wave, June 26th, Portland hit 108 degrees. On the June 27th, we hit 112 degrees. So now we're blowing the old record out of the water. And then on June 28th, we hit 116 degrees. That's 1 degree shy of Las Vegas record. But unlike Las Vegas, that it typically experiences hot weather throughout their summer and has lots of access to air conditioning, Portland was not prepared for that. And so we had a loss of life on the scale. So over 60 folks in Multnomah County died. And that's on the scale of the Chicago 1995 heat wave that is seen as one of the top worst heat waves since records have been kept for humanity. So it's getting extreme. And that's the point, and it's getting deadly. This doesn't even know how many folks came under heat stress. And I do encourage you to review that Multnomah County report. When we think about heat and the distribution across the city, it's not even. And part of that is because of the urban heat-on effect. So where darker surfaces are exposed to the sunlight, they heat up and retain heat. For instance, in East Portland, here on the right, where this is actually a city facility. This is the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. Lots of parking, a little bit lighter color than just pure asphalt there, but right next to I-205. And over in Lentz, for instance, Dr. Vivek Chandas from PSU measured a temperature on June 28th of 122 degrees. It could have actually been even higher than that because that was just one temperature reading. And then in other parts of the city, like Goose Hollow here, I'm showing on the left, where there's also an intersection of freeways, but there's a lot of green space and there's a lot more trees than East Portland. And as shown on the map, areas like that are significantly cooler during heat waves. This is a typical summer afternoon mapped for based on modeling from Dr. Shonda's of the distribution of heat within the city based on this urban heat island effect. You can see it's uneven. Neighborhoods in North Portland, Cully, East Portland are where there's less green space and more asphalt, experience higher temperatures. This is a Celsius scale on the left. In terms of Fahrenheit, it's 20-degree difference that could happen across the city. So we need to do something. And I think many of you have heard the city, especially my Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, who created this graph and has been tracking carbon emissions, talk about how well we're doing on addressing carbon emissions. And that was very true. I've been with Bureau since 2007, and we made a lot of progress until about 2012. That's a decade ago. At that point, our emissions, which are shown in red here for the county, started to plateau. We haven't made much progress. Since 1990, we've reduced our emissions by about 20%. Our goal, though, to address climate change is to get to 50% reduction by 2030. That's only 8 years away. So we need to make significant progress just to get to that goal. By 2050, our goal is to get to zero carbon emissions. And that's the city's goal, not just the Bureau's. It's also the county's goal. I do want to note here too that the commercial sector has increased in the last decade by 16% in their carbon emissions. So in some ways, parts of our building sectors have been going the wrong direction of where we need to go. We look at where buildings generally contribute to carbon emissions. It's basically buildings and transportation that we really need to reduce the emissions on if we're going to reach those targets. The building emissions are actually higher than transportation emissions now. This is from 2019. When we hit 2020, because of the pandemic, I think we'll see this even more pronounced. We look at the building emissions themselves and break it down. Right now, our inventory, I just say right now, but in the history of what we tracked at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, our carbon emissions inventory for buildings is based on high-level aggregated data at the industrial, residential, and commercial sectors of energy consumption. So we see that from the utilities every year. But we also built a bottom-up model as part of a decarbonization roadmap to look at what is the breakdown by sectors within the buildings. And so commercial, we've estimated it about half of the emissions are coming from commercial. That large commercial on the left, the dark blue area, that's 20,000 square feet and over. That is the threshold for the commercial energy reporting. So we have a pretty strong sense of what those emissions are. The multifamilies in purple here, that's about a quarter of our emissions. You can see regulated affordable housing is a small part, but it is 2% of our emissions roughly. And then single family is a very large, another sector, about a third of our emissions. But we are, with this policy concept, we are looking at large commercial and multifamily with the thresholds to be determined based on information that you provide, and that will come in later meetings. Here's an example. I'm just going to do a time check to be sure, leave some room for my other speakers here. Here's an example of when we get to the 2050 goal of net zero emissions. We have examples in Portland right now. Ankeny Row is the first residential project in Portland to achieve net zero carbon emissions. But we also have this, the Junkie Delta Community Center, the first commercial building to do so. So you might be familiar with Junkie. It is over at Albina and Ainsworth across from Peninsula Park. A great space to have community gatherings. It's not just a building. It's mostly about people to gather. It is a retrofit of an existing building. It's a former auto garage and gas station. So the leadership of the Junkie Delta sisters, who is a Black sorority, when they just started shooting for like, what should we do when we remodel this building? They thought, let's go for the highest level of sustainability out there, the Living Building Challenge. One aspect of the Living Building Challenge is net zero carbon emissions. And so trying something new in that way that has not been done before, it took a while to figure it out, and I'm happy to say that they are the first. And so they produce more emissions from their solar panels. We're looking at the underside of their solar panels. They produce more electricity from their solar panels over the course of a year than the electricity that they consume. And so that we call that net zero carbon emissions with on-site solar. Thinking of June Key and the leadership of Black women there, and the emergence of climate justice, and how we're seeing that there's leadership throughout the city that's coming from culturally specific community-based organizations and Black and Brown folks in Portland. That in 2017 was really highlighted by the People's Climate March. And I just need to pause for a minute, because there is giant hail coming down like cats and dogs around. This is the extreme weather that I'm talking about. I see somebody trying to run out of it. Good luck. By climate justice, I mean the intersection of climate action and racial justice. So I've been in Portland since 1994. I've been to a lot of Earth Day marches that were a lot of fun, and a lot of, and generally, I'm half white and half Asian, generally led by the white leadership here from nonprofits. Wonderful folks that, it was really through great marches and after parties too. What I saw in 2017 was different though. At the very front of the march was to have a mix of Black and Brown folks in the leadership, along side by side with environmental nonprofits. And that was a big change that I saw. By 2018, there was organizing around the Portland Clean Energy Fund ballot measure, and generally a lot more leadership emerging in climate justice from community-based organizations. And so what I'm pointing to here is that when we're looking at our buildings and where those emissions come from, it's the heating and cooling and powering of our buildings. And there is an intersection there with right now our dependency on fossil fuels to do so, and climate justice issues. So to understand what those intersections were, I was looking for an opportunity to really engage deeper with Black and Brown voices that had not been at the table in our climate action planning processes previously. So I've been involved in the last 2 climate action plans. The last one, 2015, we also had an equity working group. And that group was made up of a handful of community-based organizations who reviewed 171 actions that we had drafted with many of the stakeholders who are in the room right now. And to inform us, should we have equity considerations with these actions? And that they were a huge help to us, and we had honorariums for them to do so. But what I heard at the end of that process was that, thank you for reaching out to us, but we really want to be involved in the policy decision-making, and at the beginning, not halfway through or towards the end of major decisions like this for the city. So about that time, 2017, 2018, the city was involved with Movement Strategy Center, a nonprofit out of Oakland, in what was called the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership. We were also working with Providence and Seattle and Washington, DC, because we all had strong equity considerations within our climate action planning. And so MSC developed this tool that is now nationally recognized and used by many cities across the country, of how to move towards greater community involvement and community leadership within climate action planning and what is now climate justice. And I think in Portland, we were thinking like, oh, great, we're in the involved part right here. But MSC actually said, no, you came towards the end of a process, and that's a handful of organizations of their experience, and that can be tokenizing. So initially we were taken back like, oh, that's not what we want to do. Like, I thought we just made progress. Yes, we made progress, but there's more progress to make. And so I was looking for an opportunity really to have a project where we could have Black and Brown voices at the beginning and move the needle towards collaboration and deferring to community. So that project is called the Zero Cities Project. 2 twin goals. This is an urban sustainability directors network. Developed these twin goals for participation, increasing racial equity, and getting to zero carbon building sector by 2050. And they helped us put together that decarbonization roadmap I mentioned earlier. A couple of familiar folks in there, Architecture 2030 helped us with that roadmap. we've been working with them. New Buildings Institute, a longtime partner who's also present in the room today. Movement Strategy Center, I mentioned earlier, they were the equity consultant to bring together a group of community partners that were leading on climate justice. So those are Verde, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, APANO, Coalition of Communities of Color, CCC, Opal Environmental Justice, the Portland African American Leadership Forum, now known as Imagine Black, and the Native American Youth and Families Association, also known as NAYA. But at that time, NAYA chose not to participate. And so we moved forward with the 5 organizations and started to explore some intersections that another equity consultant, Race Forward, identified for us. One of those is energy cost burden. So the percent of income spent on, I'm sorry, the percent of, yes, no, I'm saying that right, percent of income spent on energy bills. Knowing that energy, the cost of energy can be the deciding factor for someone of whether or not they can afford to live with it where they are, or if they might displace into another neighborhood that's more affordable. And the long-term effect of that is gentrification of whole neighborhoods. We looked at generally at economic prosperity, workforce development, and wealth building. We also looked at substandard housing, particularly around rental housing that has had not as much investments on energy efficiency, especially when tenants don't pay the bills, also known as the split, or when tenants do pay the bills, the landlords don't, known as the split incentive. And health risks within there. That's an intersection we had not looked at very closely in the past. Urban heat island I referred to earlier, and then community-led engagement versus the cities leading the community engagement. So an example of how we were able to kind of approach some of the major issues here around energy cost burden, which we really saw with our community team as a major issue related to displacement, is to look at across the city, what is the energy burden by census tract? And so you can see that there are neighborhoods that are here highlighted in darker red color that are what we call energy burden. So that's based on the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. They refer to 6% of income spent on energy bills as energy burden. The average across the city is 3%, for reference. So 10% is considered severely energy burden. So what you see in red here is 6%, the dark red is 7%. And so you can see that there are neighborhoods in Closen, Northeast, Cully, and East Portland, where folks spend quite a bit, in other neighborhoods as well. The large one on the left is Linton, essentially, is guiding that census tract. You can see there are neighborhoods that spend a very large amount of their dollars on energy. So I do want to point out before I turn this over to Nikita Daryanani from Build Shift, that this is mapped data from the American Community Survey and using the US Department of Energy LEAD tool. But this is annual data, and it's aggregated in a way that isn't really telling the stories of people. And so what we wanted to have to complement this type of information for decision making is really lived experience. So particularly around a monthly, not annual average, but a monthly winter heating bill. How does that impact folks? So I'm going to turn it over to Nikita Daryanani from the Coalition of Communities of Color, who's been a leader for the Build Shift community team, building community shifting power, and have her introduce some of the work and what we heard. Nikita, I'll go ahead and advance slides as you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm Nikita, she, her pronouns. As Marty said, I work with, and Vin said I work with CCC. So we've been working in partnership with Verde in the city to coordinate the Build Shift Collective, which is a group of BIPOC community leaders working to build community and shift power. We seek to build a community across the Portland metro area, share knowledge and community wisdom, and shift political power to Black and Brown folks through leadership development and participatory policy making. So this group formed a couple of years ago and has been doing shared learning and capacity building around buildings and energy with a focus on racial justice and climate justice ever since. Go to the next slide, Vin. So Build Shift has led several community workshops and convenings for Black, Indigenous, and people of color over the past few years. So the group held a community forum in December of 2019 where folks discussed concerns around renters' rights and energy and housing, some of the things that Finn just mentioned. The group also hosted virtual community workshops in 2021, focusing on the compounding crises that were facing the community at the time, 2020, that were facing the community at the time, and then returned to their focus on energy at the end of the year. So we held a virtual workshop in March of last year, focusing on energy burden. So this is where participants shared their experiences with energy burden, what it feels like, the types of choices that people had to make in order to pay their bills and be comfortable in their homes. We shared some resources, and so we'll share in a couple slides some of the findings from this workshop and the next one. We used the information that we gathered here and hosted a two-part policy convening in July of last year, and this was weeks after the historic heat wave. We talked a lot about the heat wave and folks' experience. I think in total at the two workshops we had around like 50 participants or 60 participants, and so we talked about their experiences. Many participants were actually renters, so we got to hear firsthand about how they managed the extreme temperatures, the types of things that they had to do to take care of themselves and their loved ones and their communities, and we talked about the personal and community values that we wanted a policy to hold. Go to the next slide. So this is a word cloud where we collected these values from participants at the workshop. And so as you can see, justice, safety, sustainability, health, community, family, education, equity, empathy were really front of mind for participants. And so these are the values that we are carrying with us throughout this whole project and are at the heart of what we're trying to do. Just a little heart standards joke of what we're trying to do. And these are the values that folks are holding. They think policy should hold, that these are the values that we want the city to hold in its development of policy as we develop this together. Go to the next slide. So through our workshops, we found that energy burden for those who participated ranged from about 1.8% to 45%. So this is the percentage of their income monthly that's spent on energy bills. So we had, we made a little like calculator tool for folks who were at that March convening to calculate their energy cost burden. So those are the numbers that we found. We also provided information about utility programs and other resources, and found that the majority of folks who were there weren't aware of these resources, that they were available to them. We learned about the family and social network obligations that folks have around finances and paying their bills that add a layer of difficulty financially for folks. And we found that the majority of people participating didn't feel comfortable interacting with their landlords if they needed something repaired or fixed, or if they had an issue with their home. They didn't feel comfortable reaching out for a variety of reasons. And so we've identified several policy priorities, including setting minimum standards and upgrades for rentals. Lowering utility bills is really important, and keeping rent stable as a central point of what we're trying to do. And keeping rent stable is when improvements are made. Incentive opportunities for clean energy investments, and avoiding placing burdens on renters. So that is really central to what we're doing here. And more accessible energy assistance, more robust, more accessible energy assistance to low-income folks, and tenant and renter right to know information about energy and the types of energy and energy costs that their home might incur, to help people make informed rental decisions. So all of these discussions and workshops and meetings culminated in our proposal for what we are calling the HEART standards, which stands for health, equitable energy, anti-displacement, resilience, and temperature, and focuses on renters in the city. So we're excited to be in this next stage of developing this together and really nailing down what this could look like. So I'll pass it back to Vin to talk more about these goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. So I'm going to turn it over to Zach Hart here, just to highlight what those 5 areas the HEART might look like is around health, improving health and indoor air quality. Equitable energy is about reducing carbon emissions, but maybe beyond that as well. So let's think of that long-term time frame at the 2050. And then preventing displacement of people, building resilience to specific things like wildfire smoke, but also power outages that go along with wildfire events, usually in summer, as we've seen in California already. They've been experienced for the last 10 years. And then in terms of temperature, setting maximum indoor temperature limits to protect folks during these heat waves. So these are the 5 areas of the policy proposal concept that you all have access to, that we would like to go over in more detail in future sessions. Today is more introductory, and I'd like to pass it over to Zach Hart to share a bit, specifically around the second bullet here, what we're seeing as a wave across the country of new policy developments. So Zach, are you all set?
Yes, thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. Nice to speak with you today. I'm Zach Hart with the Institute for Market Transformation. We're a nonprofit organization that works with local governments and real estate primarily to promote high-performing buildings, so low carbon, energy efficient, healthy buildings. We've had the opportunity to work with a number of cities which have adopted building performance standards, sometimes called BPS. We'll avoid that term since it can be confusing with the name of Vin's office, but if I say BPS, it's just by habit. So there's a growing trend right now of US state and local governments adopting building performance standards. Since 2018, we've seen 9 governments, that's 6 cities and 3 states, which you can see on the map, that have passed building performance standards. And then most recently, the state of Maryland adopted standards just last week. Next slide, please, Spin. So again, that's 9 policies since 2018, and we can expect that number to keep growing and to keep growing at a rapid pace. So earlier this year, the White House Center on Environmental Quality announced the formation of the National Building Performance Standards Coalition. The coalition is comprised of 33 governments, which have committed to a goal of adopting BPS by April 2024. And you can see on the map, a representation of all those signees to the coalition. The 2 green states are states that have joined. So Washington State and state of Colorado are members. You can actually, there's a website for the National Building Performance Standards Coalition if you'd like to look to see all those place names. Next slide, please. So why are we seeing this fast growth in adoption of building performance standards? So since 2009, over 40, mostly local governments, including the city of Portland, have adopted benchmarking and transparency laws. And we've seen about 15 local governments adopting additional building performance requirements. So think of Seattle's building tune-up law as an example. A prescriptive requirement that building owners do a building tune-up, make sure that they're operating efficiently. And while all of these are helpful policies for improving the performance of buildings, they are not driving sufficient improvements to meet these jurisdictions' climate goals. So for that reason, we've seen the leading jurisdictions on climate and building performance policy converge on a strategy of requiring buildings to meet performance thresholds that align with their ultimate carbon reduction goals. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I just want to give you an idea of what a building performance standard could look like. There are a number of variations in how the existing performance standard laws are structured, and there'll be an opportunity to discuss the details of those in future meetings. But for now, I just wanted to present a conceptual model so you get an example of what we're talking about, and we're on the same page for the discussion today. So what you see on the screen here is a very simple diagram illustrating one structure of BPS that IMT developed called the trajectory approach. We developed it kind of as an amalgam of what we thought were the best elements of the early adopters policies. And this was the basis of the most recent city to pass BPS, Denver's policy, which was adopted last November. But anyway, what we can see here, on the y-axis, we've got carbon emissions. On the x-axis, we have time starting at a baseline year going out to 2050. And we've got 3 buildings plotted on this graph. These are 3 buildings. It's important to note 3 buildings of the same type. So we can imagine for this example that these are 3 office buildings, office A, office B, and C. So the way that a performance standard in this structure would work is that the city would set a final carbon emission standard for offices that every office building would need to meet by the year 2050, right? So in this example, that would be 0 carbon emissions by 2050. And then each building would have its own performance trajectory, which is determined by drawing a straight line from its performance in the baseline year to that final point of 0 in 2050. So each building would then need to show its progress toward the final standard at a set number of interim checkpoints. So just for the sake of the diagram, we use the years 2030 and 2040 as interim standard checkpoints. But that's just for the illustration's sake. They could be at a more frequent basis than that. So the idea here is to provide certainty to the building owners of where they need to perform, but also be fair and recognize that building owners are starting from different baselines, and we want to meet them where they are and not expect the lower performing buildings to kind of make all their performance improvements all at once. So we realized that would be expensive and very difficult to do. So that's kind of the unique thing about this approach, is that you're letting building owners, you're telling building owners they need to achieve the final standard. There are interim standards to make sure that no one's kicking the can down the road to 2050, but it's meeting building owners where they are and providing a degree of flexibility in meeting those interim standards to make sure that this is achievable and fair to all covered buildings. Then could you go to the next slide? So just to kind of wrap up my portion of the presentation, I wanted to summarize what a BPS is in general terms. And again, I said BPS, what a building performance standard is in general terms. It's a policy that intends to generate significant improvement in the performance of a wide range of buildings over a long period of time. And rather than dictating specific improvements to owners, such as saying you need to make lighting improvements and everyone needs to do X, Y, and Z improvements to their building envelope. Instead, just sending a long-term signal to owners that there's a specific performance threshold that they'll need to meet, and setting it up so that owners have the opportunity to integrate those targets into their capital planning cycles to find the right approach for their building.
Thank you, Zach. And I wanted to know before I pass the mic back that we will have a Q&A here after we hear from Sean and Mark about how we're starting to see these building performance standards applying, like in implementation, whether there are actual standards within the Northwest or not, but Washington State does have standards right now. But what's that starting to look like, to give you a sense of how they're playing out? So I'm either handing it back to Marty or to Sean here. I think that I'll just pass it.
Thanks, Vin. You can hand it back to me. And if you, stop sharing. Thank you so much. Okay, Vin, Nikita, and Zach, thank you so much for this grounding in why we need this policy, right? Our climate crisis, and the importance of being grounded in people and in an equitable outcome. And then also, Zach, thanks so much for this kind of big picture overview of what this type of performance standard policy means. So now we're going to turn to our next two presentations that are going to delve deeper and be a bit more technical in nature. So I would like to first call up Sean Denniston. Sean is a self-described buildings geek. He wrote that, not me. He has degrees in architecture and historic preservation, and he is a member of the New Buildings Institute team. There, he does research and policy on energy issues in commercial and multifamily buildings, and he has a particular focus on existing buildings, which is absolutely critical for the work ahead of us. Sean, take it away.
Thank you very much, Marty. So I'm going to go ahead and share and make sure that you all see the right screen. Are you seeing my presentation screen?
We also see your presenter notes, like we see the next slide that's coming
Yeah,
up.
that's what we have to do. There we go.
There you go.
So thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name is Sean Denniston. I'm a senior project manager with New Buildings Institute. Our office is in Portland, so we're local, and this is something near and dear to our hearts. And I'm going to talk about how to conceptualize this going for building standards as opposed to maybe how our buildings have interacted with building regulations in the past. So, historically, if we're talking about carbon emissions, energy efficiency, we've really regulated that through energy codes. And energy codes are very construction focused. You have to meet certain requirements when you build a building, like on the left, or if you're altering a building, expanding additions, those sorts of things, you have to bring what you touch up to the code. So this very construction way of thinking about buildings. But when we make that transition to building standards, and I think that Vin and Zach really nailed this about how it's a different way of thinking about our buildings and what we're asking from our buildings, where we're not thinking about just construction events, but we have requirements that apply to buildings, whether or not they're going through construction events, so that we can make a meaningful impact on all of those buildings. So if we're thinking about carbon intensity, this is something should look similar based on what Zach was talking about. You have a place where your building is starting, and you have a place where your building needs to get. So we have carbon intensity on the left, we have time on the bottom. We need to get from where we are to where we're going. And if we have something like a building standard, like Zach was talking about, maybe we have some interim targets between now and then, when we'll have to make a certain amount of progress or where we'll have to meet a certain level of performance. And I think a really good way to think about this, since we're not thinking about construction events anymore, and we're thinking about time and performance over time, is I'm going to think about a building the way a historic preservationist thinks about a building. This is a diagram that I love out of Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn. And what it shows is that different parts of the building are renewed at different life cycles, different periods of time. So you have the site that's just there. And then the structure lasts longer than the skin. The services are the buildings inside, and those cycle more frequently, and the space plan more frequently, and the stuff, as he puts it. So if we're thinking about this in terms of energy, we might think about, we have major renovations that are on a very long cycle, every 30 to 50 years on average, could be more, could be less. And then our HVAC replacements, or heating and cooling and ventilation systems, those get altered or replaced on a more frequent basis, maybe every 15 to 30 years. Our lighting gets replaced or has a major alteration even more frequently, maybe every 5 to 7 years these days. Leasing might be something like a 2 to 7 year life cycle. And then we have all these other events that just happen in the life cycle of building. Maybe it's a building sale, maybe it's a building refinance, maybe a car hits the building and you have to repair it, an unexpected equipment replacement, all these things that might be a little bit more unexpected. And so if we overlap these interim targets that you might see from a performance standard, they're very arbitrary dates, and maybe who knows how they line up with the actual building cycle events of your building. But when we look at it, each one of these really creates an opportunity to intervene in the life cycle of a building, to improve its carbon performance. So these are the natural opportunities that we have for meeting any kind of standards through something that is based on a building standard instead of a construction code. And I think thinking about it this way provides a different way of thinking about our buildings and where those opportunities are to make improvements. We can look at this a different way. So this is a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more linear. So we have different categories of what's going on in the building. So light bulb, we have lighting, we have cooling along the side here, heating, the building envelope, solar PV, we have service hot water, so water heating, we have the people in the building, and we have the maintenance of the building, and this last one is that those interim standards, those interim targets. And this is what it might look like in a typical building. You know, things get replaced when it needs to get replaced. Probably doesn't get replaced beforehand unless maybe a tenant really wants it and is willing to pay for it. But under these kind of building standards, we can start to think about how a building's life cycle might shift so that we can really leverage these life cycle events to make it most effective and cost effective to meet these kind of interim targets. So let's put that stuff in the background. We still have our interim targets from the building standard, and maybe that lighting retrofit happens earlier, because anything we do for efficiency earlier is going to have a bigger impact than it will later, just because the electrical grid is decarbonizing over time. And so we're going to have the best return of investment if we move those kinds of efficiency things forward. And then on cooling, maybe we look at doing an air conditioning upgrade, and maybe we look at going even farther to a high performance heat pump and making sure that those things happen soon enough before any of these interim targets, so that the impact they have on the carbon performance of our buildings registers for that next interim target. For the envelope upgrade, maybe we shift that so that it coincides with our cooling system replacement, so that we can downsize our cooling equipment. There are these synergies in our building systems where doing one thing in one place can help somewhere else. So maybe bringing those together can really help as we're going to this, what is our ultimate goal? As Marty asked, what do things look like 30 years from now? Your solar, maybe it's not so just arbitrary, we're going to do it when we do it. Maybe it's delayed so that it goes in place with a roof replacement, because you're going to have the scaffolding or the crane, depending on the type of building, the things that you need to get people and equipment to your roof there. Why not do all the work at the same time to make it more cost effective? Water heating, maybe you shift that equipment replacement forward so that the savings that you get from better equipment actually helps you meet one of those interim targets. On leasing, instead of just engaging your tenants about energy and carbon consumption issues, whenever you release the lease, you have an annual or an ongoing engagement with your tenants so that they can help be part of the solution of meeting these requirements. And then the same thing with maintenance. Instead of just, we maintained the building and we fixed stuff when it broke. And if it wasn't broke, we didn't do anything. That we actually think about keeping that equipment running in a really good state all the time. So we're doing retro commissioning on a regular cycle so that our equipment is always running at its peak efficiency of what it's capable of doing, and making sure that that happens, in a way that coincides with that the impacts of it can help us meet those interim targets. And so with all these together, we can see that it's a different way of thinking about our building's life. And it's not just thinking about, oh, I've got this building, I'm gonna have to do all these things to meet these standards. It's, I have this building, it's going to have these life cycle events. We're already going to be replacing certain things, making certain changes. How can we leverage those things? How can we maybe move them or make different decisions about those things so that they help us meet these building standards and they're not just completely disassociated from each other? And I think with this kind of approach, it makes it much more easier. It makes it much easier to think about building standards. This has been about carbon, but there are other parts of this policy as well, that these are the ways that we can leverage what's already happening to maximize impact. And so thank you very much for the time. I'll actually be participating through this whole process as a participant, and I'm really excited to be part of this. Thank you.
Sean, thank you so much for that presentation. I put a link to that excellent book, How Buildings Learn, in the chat, and I'm excited to see some questions coming through. So just a reminder, please put your questions in the chat, jot them down. So we'll turn to our last presentation in this learning session from Mark Frankel. Mark is an expert on building performance and policy. He has been doing this work for more than 30 years. Mark is the Director of Research and Innovation at Ecotope in Seattle, where he focuses on improving the performance of new and existing buildings and also on decarbonization. Mark, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen here and get into the right mode. Let's see. Are you guys seeing this as a slideshow? Can you guys hear me?
I'm not seeing it at all.
We don't see your presentation yet.
That's strange. It says, to me, it says it's presenting. Let's see. There we go. One more button to click. Sorry about that.
Perfect.
You know how that goes. So as mentioned, I'm with Ecotope in Seattle. We are a research and an engineering firm that does research and policy work as well. I came to Ecotope for the second time in my career, actually 2 years ago from NBI, where I spent a long time working together with Sean. I'm very familiar with the policy aspects of this performance standards, but today I'm going to talk about buildings and what the outcome looks like for buildings. By way of brief introduction, I can get my mouse to work here. There we go. Ecotope, we focus on this problem of building performance and decarbonization from three aspects that I want to introduce really quickly. We're working on electric solutions for buildings to decarbonize them. We work what we call design for off, which means that we are trying to reduce the amount of time that systems are running, reduce the complexity of systems that are in buildings, and just make it simpler. And if you think about at home, in the spring and the fall, you probably don't have your heating system on, you probably don't have your air conditioning system on. There's a period of time in every year in our climate where it's very comfortable outside. And so why should our buildings be working any harder to keep us comfortable than it would be for us to walk outside? So that's the notion of design for off. Where can we find opportunities to use passive systems and natural ventilation and those sorts of things to reduce our energy signature? And then finally, just quickly, what we say when matters, because as we convert to more and more renewables on the grid, there's a lot of availability of, say, solar in the middle of the day, but at night we're still burning coal or whatever to generate electricity. So the electricity is a lot cleaner in the daytime than at night. And utilities are starting to recognize this and put incentives in place. So when we talk about the long-term goal of decarbonization, when matters, when we're using energy matters in terms of the character of the energy. So just a little context on the work that Ecotope is doing. So we've talked about the way portfolio standards are implemented, and been some really good explanations from Zach and Sean about what the opportunities look like and how to think about the cycling. At Ecotope, we've been working closely with the state of Washington on their clean building performance standard law. And it takes a similar approach, but I just want to explain the nuanced difference because it explains some of the ways that we respond in buildings. So one thing that the policy does immediately is it addresses performance outliers. That means that it looks in the policy, buildings that are really poorly performing are targeted early by the policy. They immediately see an enforcement requirement to have to improve. So the very worst buildings are targeted, and there's incentives that are associated with that from the state through utilities that can support building improvement if you find out early that you're one of those buildings. But so the trajectory for those buildings is different from the general building stock as a whole. But then also there's the long-term performance outcomes, which is the net zero by 2050, or however the language is defined in any given policy, that sets the trajectory that these buildings are trying to target and gives them a pathway and an understanding of it. And this is where Sean's discussion about sort of understanding the opportunities, that come up, and knowing that when a system breaks down, you're going to have to put in a better one or whatever. It really changes the discussion with building owners about recognizing what the long-term trend is and gets them on board with what that might look like. So I'm going to show you some project examples. These are most examples where we've gone deep on this goal, deep towards performance and decarbonization. There's some strategies that come up again and again in our deployment. So one thing that's very optimistic or opportunistic, excuse me, is building operations. There's almost no building out there that doesn't have room for improvement through better operations, through better attention to thermostat set points, maintenance issues, things like that. And there's a lot of buildings that are recognizing that now as they see what the trajectory looks like to meet the portfolio standards. They're recognizing that investing in better operations is a key part of this. And some of them have a huge savings opportunity there, whether it's just through, attention or through actual retro commissioning, what have you. That's a consistent theme in building performance improvement. We're moving very aggressively towards heat pumps to replace other heating systems. These are very efficient. The efficiency of a heat pump is about 3 to 1, meaning that you get about 3 times as much energy out of it in terms of heat and cooling as the electricity you put in. If you think about electric strip heating that we see in a lot of low-income housing, that's a 1-to-1 efficiency. We consider that 100% efficiency. All the electricity going in is turning into heat. With heat pumps, we get 3 times as much energy out of that going in, and it works, like your refrigerator works. Then we also focus on ventilation strategies. We put heat recovery in ventilation. We separate the ventilation out so it's not part of the central system, so that if you're, because you always need ventilation even in times when it's really mild outside. So if you're just bringing in fresh air through the DOAS, which is dedicated outside air system, and you don't have to turn on your furnace, your air conditioning to move the ventilation area, there's a ton of savings there. And then envelope performance, of course, is a critical piece of the equation, or can be a really big part of the equation. It's much harder to address in existing buildings. It's an investment. It pays off for itself over time, but it adds a whole layer of challenge to existing buildings. So we have to be very opportunistic with that. And then, of course, lighting. The lighting you buy at the store now, for the most part, has made the transition to the high technology LED stuff. That is the main thing that's installed. In existing buildings that don't have that already, almost any lighting upgrade you do is going to make a huge difference in terms of the technology. But if you're already at LED, then there's not a whole bunch more left actually to save in that area. So just, I'm going to show you how this plays out in a couple projects we've worked on. These are all but one of these are retrofits. So they're varying degrees of depth of retrofit, but I'll just give you an idea of what the technologies look like. This is a King County Housing Authority building. This was a strip mall building that the county bought and converted into their housing office. We did it, the whole project was done very inexpensively. It was about $100 a square foot for the whole retrofit, which is very cheap in this space. We ended up with an EUI around 27 kBTU per square foot per year. That's the sort of the standard metric of building performance. EUI stands for energy use intensity, and it's a measure of how much energy, electricity, and gas, or whatever BTUs go in to serve the entire building loads through the course of a year. Anything in the 20s is considered pretty good performance. It varies somewhat by building type. The worst buildings in this, say, city of Portland, the worst office buildings are probably well over 100. A good office building now that meets code is probably coming in the high 30s, low 40s. It depends on what kind of equipment goes in, what people are doing there, how many hours a day they're there. There's all kinds of dependencies. But generally, when you see numbers in the 20s, you're talking about a high performance building. This particular project, we installed variable refrigerant flow systems, which is a fancy new air conditioning type system, heating and air conditioning. If you've seen the houses or multifamily buildings or others with little cassette heaters mounted on the wall with a pipe going out to an outside unit, that's a variable refrigerant flow system. It's a type of heat pump that's highly efficient. The refrigerants in those, you have to be very careful not to lose the refrigerant during installation. So the leakage of refrigerant is a separate issue. And we're seeing a transition to cleaner, better refrigerants like CO2 over time, but still it's a very efficient system. In this building, again, we put in the heat recovery ventilation. We did upgrade the windows and added daylighting to this. That was the main part of envelope upgrade we did. Windows are a big part of envelope performance, as I'm sure you're aware. But we didn't go, we did opportunistic insulation upgrades, but we didn't completely replace the envelope or gut it out. As I mentioned, this is a strip mall to office replacement. It was less than $100 a square foot all in, which was very, very cost effective. And the performance we achieved at 27 kb2 per square foot is what we would call net zero ready, meaning that if they decided to invest in photovoltaics on the roof, they have enough roof area to offset the energy use completely, but they did not invest in PV. So another example is the West Side School. This was a church that was converted to a private school. This was a pretty major upgrade that came out very, very efficient and very nice space. Excuse me, this building achieved an EUI of 14 kb per square foot. That's very low. It's got zonal heat pumps, energy recovery ventilation, super insulated envelope. It's got a natural passive ventilation mode. Ceiling fans help mix the air up. So there's times of the year when nothing's running but fans, and it's very comfortable. We won some awards for this. We're very proud of this building. But again, it sort of shows really how far you can go with a deep retrofit. And when we talk about the end goals of 2050, you know, we can do that right now. We can deliver those kinds of buildings right now. So that's a really important takeaway, is that we already know how to do this. It's another example. This was a library upgrade in Sitka, Alaska. It's a very cold site. So when it's cold, you need more heat. So the EUIs tend to be a little higher. This building, we increased the size of the building by 1/3 and reduced the total energy use for the whole building by 2/3. So that was a very successful outcome for them. It's a very nice space. We ended up with an EUI of 32 in a very cold climate. We electrified because their local fuel source is hydropower, and they had diesel generators before, or fuel oil. This was fuel oil boilers, which they had to bring in on boats. Very expensive fuel, very expensive to bring in. They had a lot of hydropower. So, and the heat pump technology has moved to the point now where we can put those in really cold climates. So we converted to heat pumps to heat this building. We did all the usual things that I keep talking about: the heat recovery, ventilation, lighting upgrade, heat recovery. And so this was a really great project. Again, we increased the size of the heated area by 1/3 and reduced the total fuel use by 2/3. So again, these are really good outcomes when you go deep on these buildings, and they come out very nicely. So the opportunity exists now. This is an office in Seattle. It was an old Sears auto warehouse, an old concrete building that an architecture firm bought and decided to make into their offices. It's another example of a building that much of the year, everything's off, the windows are open and the fans are running, and that's all they need to stay comfortable in the space, which of course makes it for very efficient systems because we're just not turning them on. We did upgrade the building envelope significantly in this project. We've got the heat pumps again. You're hearing me sound the same every time because these solutions are ready to roll out. A lot of natural ventilation. Systems are off half of the year. We also incorporated rainwater catchment in this building, and the whole upgrade from this really messed up old concrete building to a very, very nice office that's super efficient cost $105 a square foot all in. So these are really inexpensive, deep retrofit projects. This project is also LEED Platinum and won of various other awards. So now I want to talk about multifamily for just a moment. We've done, Ecotop has done a bunch of work on sort of multifamily building loads and understanding where the energy use is going and what the opportunities look like. And one really huge opportunity in multifamily is domestic hot water. Domestic hot water, depending on the building, represents 25 to as much as 35% of the total energy use in multifamily buildings is to generate hot water. And in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of those systems are electric. And when you convert from an electric hot water system to a heat pump hot water system, you get 17% total building energy savings from deploying one technology. So So that is a huge savings opportunity in the multifamily sector. We're working aggressively with BPA and NEA and other utilities, Seattle City Light and others up and down the West Coast, to develop incentives and programs around the deployment of heat pump water heaters. And NBI is also deeply involved in that as well. So there's a lot going on in this space, but it's a huge savings. And the reason I mention it this way is because, like, for example, we're working with a client right now in Portland where their existing hot water system is failing and they want to replace with more efficiency instead of just buy the same thing like for like. So again, this is an opportunity to really take a bite out of their energy use by being thoughtful about what they upgrade or replace their existing system with. So to give you a couple project examples, this is a low-income elderly project in Seattle, the Elizabeth James House. This project had electric boilers for hot water in the building. The amount of energy use that those require is massive, huge transformers, really big peak loads, which the utility doesn't like, and not very efficient at the maximum 100% efficient electricity when we can get 3 times as much use out of that same amount of electricity by converting to heat pumps. So what these systems look like, these are the little Sandin CO2 heat pump units. We put in 4 of them to serve this building. They replaced this massively huge boiler. Each of those is 5 tons. They can stage up in series like this, and they serve all the hot water for the building. It's a super efficient strategy. The refrigerant, as I mentioned, is CO2, which is very, very low impact. I mean, we always talk about CO2 impacts. The impact of a ton of CO2 is, CO2 is 1, right? Some of the other refrigerants are hundreds or thousands for the same volume in terms of the impact. So CO2 is even though we measure CO2 emissions, CO2 is a very friendly, benign refrigerant to use in these systems. And these systems are becoming more and more available. We've also been working with heat pump manufacturers to make these into roof-mounted units. This is a project we're working on in Seattle right now called Bayview Tower. We're replacing the existing heating systems with these low GWP CO2 units. We're expecting a cost savings on energy use for domestic hot water, $15,000 a year. And the cool thing about this is it comes on a truck, which makes it much, much easier to retrofit on existing buildings. You don't have to go in all the systems inside. You can just, it can show up like this. Finally, I'll show you, this is a new low-income housing project in Everett that we worked on. And this is all of our dream strategies for efficiency and decarbonization in one place. It's a really nice project. It got a grant from the state for what they call the ultra high energy efficiency achievement, which means that this project is net zero. And it's got all electric CO2 heat pump system, energy recovery, ventilation, super insulation, heat pump clothes dryers even. And it's applied to the Living Building Challenge Energy Pedal, and it's a LEED Platinum project. It's all these things are ready and available now and ready to deploy as we go down the trajectory to our reduced carbon outcomes. And I think that's probably enough to think about for now. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for that. Thank you, Sean, Vin, Nikita, and Zach, all of our presenters, for the incredible amount of information you've just passed on to us. I know, Vin, you wanted to start off. We have about 7 to 10 minutes for Q&A related specifically to the presentations you just saw. So I'd invite you to put additional questions in the chat. And Vin, I know you wanted to speak first.
Thank you, Marty. And yeah, thank you everyone for providing a great overview of the policy concept, its origins, and what this list is starting to look like in other cities in terms of energy efficiency improvements. And so the first question I'm seeing is about slides, and so Marty responded to that. So thank you, Kevin and Molly, for pointing to that. And then the next question I'm seeing is from Sean: what is driving such wild swings in recent years? And so, well, it's climate change, right? So I've been studying and researching climate change since 1990, and the modeling that's happened all the way back to then that led to the other 5 assessment reports from the UN IPCC is that we were expecting to see extreme weather events because of greenhouse gas emissions that are anthropogenic or human-induced climate change. And so it's something that we've been expecting and preparing for at the city of Portland, and now we're really living it. That since 2020, I think especially the current decade we're in, we're really starting to experience the impacts of climate change. By greenhouse gas emissions, that is our term for carbon emissions. We'll clarify that in next meeting. And the next question from House is the Architecture 2030 Building Stock Assessment available. So next meeting, I will share a lot of slides from that building stock assessment. And the model is about 80 megabytes, but we can put that in a SharePoint file or some other way to share that with you all if anybody would like to dig in. And then let's see. Yes, Nikita, thank you for sharing your expertise. And let's see, what about setting air quality standards as well as heat maximums? And these are really resilience types of standards, health and resilience standards, and we will get to those in later meetings. And so, Suzanne, please do continue to meet with us as we start to dive in and learn more about what are the air quality standards that we should be looking at. And then I think there's only one or two more here. We can open up the floor, see if more are coming to the chat. This is one for, I think this is for Mark, for when it came in. Is that EUI accounting for solar generation, or is that just energy use?
Yeah, sorry, I responded only to Marty. I meant to respond to everyone. All the EUIs we show on our slides are energy consumption. We don't account for solar in those. Most of our projects don't have solar. The exception is there's a small solar array on the RFM headquarters, but it only gets 3 UI. So I showed the UI of the building before the solar is accounted. And then I didn't have an UI shown on the slide that has a net zero building.
Thank you. And then Sean, I meant swings in the carbon emissions for Portland. There's a lot of up and down after 2012. So part of that is because of fluctuations between heavy rain years and drought years. And so the amount of hydropower really affects our electricity source mix. That is part of it, but it also has to do with we aren't seeing the changes that we need to see in reducing greenhouse gases from transportation and building sectors. Industrial has pretty steadily been going down since 2000. Let's see, what else we have here from Stephen. In multifamily buildings where apartments have individual electric or gas water heaters, are heat pump heaters replaced in each unit, or does a new heating infrastructure need to be put in place? How are the heating costs apportioned with centralized systems? I think that is a question for Mark also.
Yes, so a lot of multifamily buildings in the Pacific Northwest have individual in-unit heating systems, and it is a larger task to replace those with central systems for sure. Unfortunately, the unit by unit heat pumps for apartments add complexity because they change the temperature of the space. So you have to figure out where you're venting them to and what the heat source is. And sometimes they get vented outside. So it's a lot simpler to deploy a central heat pump system and then just pipe the hot water around the building. So that's our preferred approach, and that's what we work on. The heating cost, or the apportionment of heating costs, really depends on the way the building is structured and whether you can put in flow meters. That's expensive. You can calculate a load based on number of occupants, which is really what drives hot water use. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And some jurisdictions require that the metering all sort of have some separate way of metering, and some projects just combine it and give everyone a share. So the answer can vary. And I actually think the next question's for me also, Vince. I'll just answer it, which is net zero is mentioned. Do projects use GHG offsets to meet net zero? Up to till now, and we can talk about this, but up to now, when net zero is generally talking about energy. When you talk about net zero carbon, that's a whole new world of how you offset carbon to get to net zero carbon. So when I use the term net zero, I'm talking about energy. And when I say net zero ready, it means that the EUI is low enough that it's conceivable that you could offset that with rooftop solar. But of course, that depends on, tall buildings don't have enough roof area to necessarily offset. And does that matter? Well, for us, it's really about building performance and where you get the clean energy to serve that building. If it's on the roof, great. If it's not on the roof, it doesn't matter as long as the building's super efficient. That's our focus. So that's a part answer, and there's a lot to talk about there. But
There is a lot, and we will have more discussion around this. And one thing I'll point out that this is something we'd like stakeholders here to help us inform what is net zero carbon emissions. So Michael, thank you for raising that. We are in a different environment in Portland where we don't have 100% hydropower. And so we need to consider what our current mix is, where that electricity source mix is going, and really look at multiple pathways to reduce carbon emissions. One is energy efficiency, which has been highlighted quite a bit here. The other is renewable energy, and that is in multiple forms. There's renewable electricity through, we've seen a lot of solar and wind grow. There's also renewable natural gas that the city currently has a partnership with Northwest Natural with their wastewater treatment plants. So if you're in Portland, every time you flush, there's a little bit of renewable natural gas being formed. And so then there's on-site, as Mark noted, offsetting, and there's also off-site. And I think that's some of the discussions that we need to dive into is what is net zero in terms of off-site and offsets or renewable energy credits. So we will get there. So do we have a couple more minutes just for questions from the field, Marty, for those who didn't post to the chat?
I think if there's any questions that people would like to pose to our speakers right now, I would invite you to put other questions into the chat. All of the questions that you ask are going to help shape the future sessions and where we spend our time together. So thank you for the ones that you've provided already. So just wait a couple of seconds, and then the next thing is we're going to take a 5-minute kind of refresher break for all of us to kind of take our eyes away from the screen and move around a little bit and attend to our needs. So any last questions?
Yeah, Emily.
Hi, this is Emily Moore. I don't know if I'm able just to speak up.
Sure.
But I just wanted to say I really appreciated these presentations, so thank you. I also wanted to add, I mean, NIA is actively working in a lot of the technology areas that Mark highlighted in his presentation, and we have some resources that we can bring into this process. I thought it would be remiss though if I didn't mention, to meet these standards, addressing envelope is going to be so important. In an area that NIA has been working on for the last several years is commercial secondary windows, which are basically window attachments. And this is an exciting area in that there's been a lot of advancement with these products, and now there are several that are commercially available that perform as well, but are half the cost of window replacements. So I just wanted to point that out because we have an increasing number of examples of these types of applications around the Northwest that folks might be interested in learning more about.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Emily. And I think, we will be sure to recruit you to come and share even more about your resources in future meetings. Okay, let's take a 4-minute break and come back together at 1:46. So you are all welcome to mute yourselves, turn off your cameras, and do what you need to do in the next 4 minutes. Thank you so much. We'll see you shortly. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hopefully you're all starting to come back. If you are back and you could turn your video on, that would be super helpful. That'll cue us to know that we can get going. Okay, so nice to see you all again. Just wait another 30 seconds or so. Just a reminder, if you're just coming back and sitting down, if you are willing to, please turn on your video. That'll help us know that everybody's back in the room and we can get ready for our small group discussions. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to acknowledge that we have all just had a huge amount of information presented to us and only about 4.5 minutes to synthesize it. So I want to ask that you continue to kind of take what you've learned and ponder it and think about what your questions are over the next couple of weeks before we meet again. But in the short term, we're actually going to launch into some conversation. So in just a couple minutes, we're going to open up breakout rooms. There will be 5 rooms, and each room will have a facilitator. So you're either going to be with Vin, Andrea Jacob, Dirk Larson, Irene Kim, or me. And once you get into your breakout room, your facilitator will introduce the discussion activity. After we have these breakout conversations, about a half an hour, we're going to come back together and we're going to get a very quick report out of what each of our groups talked about. So what are we going to be talking about? So we have 2 big picture questions, and I am popping those into the chat now. Your facilitator will tell you more in just a few minutes, but broadly speaking, we want to hear from you, right? We've given you a lot of information. What questions does it bring up for you? Specifically, what do you want to spend time on, right? Over the next 3 to 4 sessions that we're to get together. What are the things you need to know more about this policy? And then we want to hear also about your organization, right? How does your organization work? What are the processes, the important deadlines, the important barriers or things that you need to address in order to make a policy like this work? So this is the time, I think, where it's really the floor is all of yours. So Wing, if you are ready to open those breakout rooms, everybody, I believe, is going to get automatically transferred into their rooms. I think you may have to click the join button. So we'll see you there.
And I have just a few of you that are unassigned, so I will do that really quickly. Hold on just a sec.
Sorry, I can get you something when I get back, okay?
This is Wayne, the tech support for the meeting. If you, you're all assigned to a breakout room. So if you're not in one, you can click on more and you'll see breakout rooms in the settings, or it might just be visible for you. Click on that and then you can choose to join the group.
Hey, can you hear me? This is Dave Fantoff.
I can, yeah. Hey, Dave.
Hey, I've got a mixed up deal in which I'm using the video from my computer, but I've got audio from my phone, and they sent me to 2 different groups.
Oh,
is there
gotcha.
a way you can send me to group 2 which is what's on my screen
Yeah.
for this one.
Yeah, what's the second group you're in? I'll take you out.
It's the Andrea Jacobs. I think it's room 2.
So I see you already in there.
I'm in there by my screen, but my audio is under, sorry, is under DEV.
Okay, you're DEV, great.
Is there a way to get DEV into the room 2?
Yeah, there we go. All right.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Nina. This is Wing with the city. I'm the tech support. Everybody's out in the breakout rooms at the moment. They were just called back.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just wait here and listen to the report out. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Could you have used more time in your small groups? Yes. Okay. Always. I know I was just asking for last comments when we were all zapped back here. Thank you so much. I will speak for my group that it was a really rich and interesting and actually enlightening conversation. So we have a few minutes left in our time together, and I want to give everybody the chance to get some sense of what the other groups that we were not in took time to talk about. So I'll ask each of the group facilitators to just give us, I don't know, 2 minutes or so overview of the key themes and topics that your group talked about. Vin, would you be willing to go first?
Sure. So questions about the policy. We heard definition of zero carbon and carbon neutrality. What else besides carbon referring to with the building performance standards? So what's the plan for when naturally occurring affordable housing has other issues like mold and structural problems that need to be addressed first? What mechanisms will be used to hold buildings owner accountable through implementation? Sorry, I don't really have these by themes yet, so I was reading some of them real quick. And then how can organizations help? What kind of that intersects with the next question is what does the city need to know? And that we should plan on spending some time unpacking health and resilience for the community groups and consider disabled community needs and retaliation of tenant complaints as they come up to address that. And then the new cooling bill that's passed and wondering how to get central air into buildings without causing extra energy burden and while making the buildings more green. And then looking at anti-displacement and the responsibility for building owners and making sure the impact of the policy doesn't fall to tenants. We also heard making sure that communities that are on the front lines are being heard in this work and can get involved through their neighborhoods. And then the last one here is what's the one or two or three things that are most critical for the Build Shift folks as they were helping craft the hard standards policy proposal.
Thank you so much, Vin. Andrea, Jacob, would you give us the outtakes from your group?
Yes. So I heard a lot from folks about, my mind immediately goes to does this apply to me? How do we operationalize this? You know, what are the actual implementation pieces? And then certainly that's very closely connected to the resource needs, financing, funding, who's going to pay, how does this get structured so that it works for the private sector, but also achieves deep carbon reductions. There's a lot of desire to see this actually achieve really deep carbon reduction and have some accountability and metrics around that, but also a lot of focus on not doing harm unintentionally, making sure that that priority communities and disadvantaged communities are engaged and, in a broader way than even recognizing that we've done some of that so far, but that there's more to do. And how do we really bring this to all the communities that it will affect? Some questions around, actually I think that's mostly it, like a little bit around compliance pathways and understanding that different buildings are at different places and will have different needs.
Thanks, Andrea. Irene, Kim, would you tell us about your group?
Yeah, so we had kind of similar questions as well. So some technical questions is really more about the policy development, how much of the policy will be about residential versus commercial, and then some questions about, just the mechanics of the policy development, what's the timeline and process, who's writing the policy, who's making the decisions. And then also some curiosity about how the metrics will get defined and how the policy plans to measure compliance. And then some financial questions about if there's any financial models that have worked in other places like Seattle and elsewhere related to these types of standards. And then some equity questions about, that there's 20 to 25 years is a long time frame for residents to make these improvements, and how can we bring the community at the table, especially building owners, and see what assistance that they can get, and is there an association of rental building owners that have that are invited to the table and are able to participate. More questions about kind of who's benefiting and burdened by these policies. How are tenants impacted, and how do we make sure costs don't pass over to tenants? And then just some other kind of comments about an interest in demonstration projects and really putting policy into action.
Thanks, Irene Kim. That's very helpful. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said your first and last name at the same time. Dirk Larson, I'd like to call on you to give us a recap of your group.
Thanks, Marty. I'm having technical difficulties, so apologize for no camera. I echoes a lot of what the other folks had to say, but I think some particular concerns were how do building performance standards work in other locations, and what are the lessons from other places. Some of the building owners in our group said that they already do this work on maintenance schedules and maintenance cycles, and they want to know how this is going to integrate with those, and what the how it will work with existing maintenance schedules, and what will it take to finance the additional things. There's concern around impacting people. And I thought was interesting, specifically, how does it impact smaller contractors and other contractors who can do this work? There's a question around time of use policy and how that will play in, like when we generate electricity versus when we use it, and how this can help with that. Otherwise it was a great conversation, and I think we got a lot of good stuff out of it.
Thanks, Dirk. Let me speak briefly about our group. So definitely some overlap with what you all talked about as well, with, I think, probably the primary question being questions about funding and what are funding opportunities to help owners pay the cost of this work. So there was a question about PSEF. Okay, maybe that's of interest, but what other kind of non-competitive grants might be available? Are there other kind of creative things that we can leverage? So there was a discussion of tax credit status for certain multifamily buildings, right? Could that be extended as a way of helping owners recoup some of the costs that they expend on this work? So creative ideas for that, and really the idea of potentially creating a map of where funding is available, and identifying gaps. Other things that we talked about were concerns about the electric supply, and wanting to hear more from our utilities about what's the plan to make sure that there is enough safe, reliable, and clean power to continue to power the things that we might be putting in our buildings. And then very interesting to me, at least, was a common theme about prioritization and planning. So especially for more institutional owners, education and healthcare, where there's a lot of buildings and a lot of them are old, where do you start, right? Help and support understanding where to do this work first. And that could be both about the building stock, but there was also a discussion about where in the city, right? Are there certain places on that heat map that Ben showed that we should be targeting first because they are most at risk? And I think that's a real intersection with our questions about equity and community. So I think we have had an incredibly intense almost 2.5 hours. I don't know how you all feel, but I personally am feeling pretty overwhelmed with the amount of information and ideas. I'd like to bring us to a close. First, by just really sincerely thanking all of you for being here and for the incredible amount of attention and engagement that you have put forth today. And I would like to now turn it over to Vin to tell us a bit about what comes next.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you for holding the space here, Marty. It's a big group, and we're still meeting online. It's challenging. I really appreciate your work to help organize the space and to hold it as well. Yeah, so we need to digest what we heard, and so we'll do a bit of that. And we want to help that inform what the agendas are going to be. We have a rough sense of what where to go next for those agendas, but we'll get those out to you sooner than the day of, so that you can really bring the right folks to the table. I know some of you have come from really big organizations. We want you to send the folks that are most informed to really dive into helping inform these key decisions, many of them that just came up in questions today. So we'll get those out to you sooner than later for the next 3 sessions, so you can plan for that. Please plan on one representative, if not 2, yes. No more than 2 within the space, because we want to keep it manageable for the size of breakout rooms that we can go into. We will follow up and share slides. Marty noted that, and a video recording for today's session. So please share that with your staff as you decide who should come to the next meetings as well. We will be sending out a survey. And so part of that survey is to note that there is another tenant working group that's happening. This is a building working group that focuses on impacted property owners. There's a tenant working group that focuses on renters of apartments. That group starts meeting next week, and so we'll be hearing some report backs back and forth as summaries of what we're hearing in each group. But in that survey, we want to propose another session, and this is, we're looking at June 8th, so that would be kind of continue the bi-weekly schedule we're currently on, same timing, noon to 2:30, where we can have both groups come back together. So we want to gauge your interest in that and hear from one another, and maybe talk about something like resources, for instance, that is came up today of what do people need from the city to make this work? And maybe the less contentious parts of like, how are folks going to be accountable, which we will get to within our meeting space here as well. So expect that. And another part of that survey will be continuing to meet online versus meeting in person. I think we have that option to meet in person and have a hybrid option to meet online as well, because some of our partners are from the East Coast even. So yeah, so please fill that out when you receive it, and we'll use that to help plan the next sessions. And that is about it. If you have any questions still, there is a very large email group out there, 75 people on it. I did note it today when I sent the agenda around. Please do not reply all. Reply to me directly, and then I'll try to answer your questions best possible. And some of the questions came up today before we go to the next sessions, or during the session too. But thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Marty?
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks for staying engaged, everybody.
Thanks for setting this up.